So here we have on the cover slide what the title of my PhD was: Investigating Factors Affecting the Future Survival of Exmoor Ponies, the Implications for Ecological Restoration and the Management of the Breeding Population, which is quite a mouthful, but in academic terms, that is how we title PhDs. And I'm also going to say thank you to the Exmoor Pony Society. Over and over and over again, during the course of my work, people have gone, wow, your little society funded this. That's really impressive. And it's quite unbelievable. I'm so grateful to you all, so thank you. Hopefully, I dedicated this work to the ponies, and what I said in my dedication was, I hope this helps to secure their future, and I genuinely do. But it does mean all of you contributed to that too. So thanks. So I'm going to start with some things that are a bit horrible to begin with. And I'm going to need a pointer. In Finland, you're given a sword on the day you graduate with your PhD. I've been kindly lent one as a pointer. This is pointing out why Exmoor ponies are going to be important in conservation in the future. This is the extent to which future generations will experience a hotter world, depending on our choices now. So for those of us who are quite elderly and born in the 50s, like me, we were born here. There's how climate has gradually been warming during our life, and this is where it's going to go. For people born in the 80s, so that's the younger people amongst you, Michael, and others, yes, and about, yeah, you're going to be seeing quite a lot more warming unless we take appropriate action now. And for young children, like my grandchildren, and probably the grandchildren of a lot of you present, by the time they reach 70 years old, we're going to be in a world which is a lot hotter and not such a good place to live unless we take action. Exmoor ponies, I sincerely hope, are going to be part of that natural solution to the climate problem. Right, I'm not going to keep using the sword, it's too heavy, but it was just to make a point. And if anyone's naughty. Could have done with that for some of the students, couldn't we? So, these slides, by the way, were provided by Dr. Richard Davey, who's a climate scientist at the Nansen Institute in Bergen, and he works with the BOKS Centre. So any climate questions, we've got Richard on board, he's far more expert than me. So this slide is talking about what is the safe operating zone for various things that we as humans are doing to the world. So the safe, there you can see in the middle, there's the map of the world, and that is the safe operating space where we are not exceeding problems that are going to hit us. So you can see we've only got 3 areas, which I won't go into, that are not a problem yet. The big problems that we have got to face are climate change and biosphere integrity and land system change. Those are the things that we are starting to see problems with, and our children and grandchildren will definitely see problems with if we don't take appropriate action. Oops, next slide. We're always going to have problems with technical because I'm still rubbish at this. There we go. So one of the solutions towards helping with these problems is going to be ecological restoration or rewilding. So I really particularly like this example. This again is a slide that Richard very kindly made for me. This is the same valley with the 10-year gap, where they actually, this was a very denuded landscape where there are endless problems with degradation, loss of biodiversity. It was just becoming a cold desert. 10 years later, with appropriate management, and appropriate management may well include grazing by Exmoor ponies, you end up with this much happier and more diverse landscape, which will store carbon better, which will have better biodiversity, which will protect potential species that could live there. So although the message is scary, positive change is absolutely visible in a remarkably short time. So I'm discussing the current problem, the drivers of that problem, which is what we as human beings have been doing for some years now, the solution to the problem, which as you can see there's a pony, which sadly, as I borrowed this from another article, isn't an Exmoor. Exmoors could be part of the solution, and the outcome, a greener world where we actually aren't having such extreme warming and where we might actually see improvements in biodiversity. The ultimate aim being global ecological stability. And we need to be part of that picture, and our very important ponies need to be part of that picture. So this is where I personally found this really quite a revelation. One of the things that's going to help, I hesitate to say save the world, but certainly make a big difference in helping us in the future, is how carbon is stored in the Earth's ecosystems. Now, I'm sure absolutely all of you have heard the message, plant a tree, help save the world. The data on this slide came from both NASA and the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change. And it shows you carbon storage above and below ground in different ecosystems and how it works. So the bigger the amount below the ground level, the more subsoil carbon storage there is, and the bigger above ground, the more above ground carbon storage there is. Now, obviously, subsoil carbon storage is going to actually be far more long-term and less likely to disruption because trees can be cut down, storms can come along, things can happen. We can end up with that carbon being put back into the atmosphere and then causing a problem again. Long-term storage underneath the ground will work as a better solution. So we've all had the message, plant trees. We've heard the government's got all these tree planting schemes. We've all done it. I've planted thousands myself. This is a good thing, but, and this was a really interesting message, which I didn't know until I looked into this properly. At temperate latitudes, we're not talking the tropics, we're talking where we live, temperate latitudes across Europe, wetlands actually store the most carbon. They store some carbon above ground, but look at the huge amount they store underground. So wetlands win prizes for carbon storage at our latitude. Beavers, remiring, I believe, is happening on Exmoor. Part of that. This is the one that surprised me until I looked into it. The next most efficient way of storing carbon at our latitude is properly managed temperate grassland. Properly managed temperate grassland, okay, small carbon budget above ground, but look at the huge underground carbon budget. So this is where our Exmoors fit in because they can be used in good management of temperate grassland. And then third, temperate forests. And again, I have occasionally said to people, I'm going to sound like I hate trees when I give a talk, and I don't hate trees. I think trees are absolutely fabulous, and I'm not saying we shouldn't plant trees, but let us not forget that well-managed grassland, which our Exmoors can be part of the management of, is actually a very good solution to a lot of the problems. So, next thing I'm going to say, and perhaps I should pick the sword up and wave it at you at this point, I hope you've all got these books on your nightstand and you've all read them and are paying proper attention to them. Oh, come on. First of all, we're going to the speed papers, which influenced both me and Sue, lots in our time. The quote actually comes from a personal letter that James Speed sent to Sue in 1977. So she very kindly, Sue, by the way, has been absolutely instrumental, absolutely fantastic, totally supportive all the time. And without her as our archivist and historian and helper, we'd have been in trouble. So she's superb. Take a bow, Sue, you totally deserve it. So that is a quote from James Speed's letter to Sue in 1977. It isn't inbreeding that I would worry about, how best to keep such a wild animal in captivity. And then he talks about some other things and he goes, I remain a heretic. Because, we've had some people telling us that our ponies are not wild ponies, that they're not actually the real thing. James Speed always believed they were. And we'll come back to this in the second part of the talk. Then the next thing that was a major influence on me, and I think I've probably bought every copy of it that's ever come up on eBay in recent years and handed them out to students and friends and everyone else, forced my poor children to read them when they were in school and everybody else. Michael Schaefer's An Eye for a Horse. Michael Schaefer was a vet who actually studied Exmoor ponies. He actually had some Exmoor ponies. They weren't his principal source of study, but I can't say he invented theory, but he certainly consolidated the theory of 4 primitive types of horse from which all modern horses are derived. One of which was the primeval pony, another was the proto-Arab, another was the proto-heavy horse, and another was the sort of cold-blooded pony. And he, in his book, published in 1980, I highly recommend you all go on eBay and buy it if you haven't already got it, suggested that the primeval pony was able to flourish over such a wide geographical range was due to the fact that it was not exclusively specialized for survival in a particular environment. In other words, it was adapted to survive along the entire western seaboard of Europe. And in the times, Pleistocene era point, when the wild horses were literally walking across the English Channel when it was dry land, he believed the Exmoor pony was the nearest thing to that primitive wild horse that was spread all along the West Coast. So bear in mind, Schaefer had our ponies in mind for morphological studies of them. He'd read the Speeds work, he'd met the Speeds, he'd been in Edinburgh with them and measured ponies. I remember Peter Dean describing Michael Schaefer as that strange German chap who came to my herd with a pair of calipers and was trying to measure their legs. But he was right about many things, and his hypothesis is something that I based a lot of my ideas around. I was absolutely inspired by it when I first read it. And are these really this primeval pony? How, can we get any evidence for that? And then, of course, next, and she's terribly embarrassed about this, is, of course, Sue's book, which has been so influential to so many people. It has really helped to draw people in. Her book on survival of the fittest, the Exmoor ponies, has been a really important thing. Sue is our fabulous archivist, and she's worked so hard on getting it right. But anyway, that we quote there from her book, I can't tell you which page off the top of my head, Independence is the Key to Wildness. I've been handing out copies of her book to the various students we've had through the place who've been tremendously helpful. And one of them was so inspired by Sue's book, she's actually had that tattooed on her arm. So every time she's out anywhere, she looks at her arm and it says, Independence is the key to wildness. Oh yes, the Exmoors. She's off. I think we've got a future supporter of Exmoors there with one of our master's students. I've got a current master's student, well, she's finished now, but yeah. We've got a current student who's actually trying to decide which quote she's going to have tattooed on her arm soon. So Sue's book has inspired the master's students at Glasgow Uni into tattoos. So we get back to this whole thing about ecology and what their role is, because without a role, they won't survive. So one of the things, we've all heard lots of anecdotal evidence about how fabulous they are and how they help. But if you want to influence big organisations, and if you're a scientist, this has to be measured and quantified properly. So here we have some nice species, which I photographed whilst crawling around in the grass being eaten by midges, and probably Vivian got eaten by midges crawling around helping me, and various other people. Rewilding. Rewilding is a tool for the repair of damaged ecosystems by restoring them to a functional state. And ecological restoration, there are people who think it's just fencing off a bit of ground and doing nothing, but that's not necessarily the case and not necessarily the best approach. Ecological restoration is assisting the regeneration of self-regulating natural ecosystems, either passively by removal of environmental stresses, which means taking away polluting, things that are causing pollution or taking away a lot of the pressures, or actively by positive management to support ecosystem regeneration. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about in this section, the active ways in which our ponies play a part in positive regeneration. This is a quote. Right at the start of my PhD, I went to Denmark on a course run by a chap who's very, very big in the ecological world called Jan Christian Svenning. He now has his entire institute of his own, and he's actually been recognised as a European Scientist of Excellence this year. This is a quote from a paper that he put out this week. Rewilding is a restoration approach that aims to promote self-regulating complex ecosystems by restoring non-human ecological processes whilst reducing human control and presence. Reducing. Doesn't mean we exclude people from rewilding sites, it just means we do less active management. We let the animals do their role as unimpeded as possible. And this beautiful photograph, by the way, comes from some of my ponies, which are at a place called Banff in Perthshire, where they're doing exactly this. They're acting as ecological engineers on 430 hectares of beautiful Perthshire. And there are lovely holiday cottages there if anyone wants to go and look. But yeah, that's part of our herd in Perthshire, acting as ecological engineers. And that paper came out this week. This is a really current topic. This is absolutely in the forefront of science at the moment. What does it do? How can we do it? And I want to push it so that people are going, Exmoors, yes, animal of choice for rewilding, animal of choice for restoration. We're getting there with that. We're not quite there yet because we need proof. So the existing purpose as ecological engineers, there is considerable potential for their use in rewilding and ecosystem maintenance. We've seen that. Moor and Mousey Trust do conservation grazing. Other people put ponies out to restore ecosystems. Those of you who live on Exmoor, you know that the beautiful moors you've got have been created and maintained in a large part by the grazing animals there. So our Exmoor ponies have been doing their work on the moor for centuries, and they're doing very good work elsewhere too. But measuring it, proving it, selling this to a wider audience so that the pony's purpose is recognised is very important. So Exmoors are already reputed to be highly effective due to naturally selected characteristics, naturally selected, living in a natural environment and having natural environmental pressures on them to make sure they retain the characteristics, living free, living wild. However, their credentials need to be scientifically demonstrated to maximise their use in this growing sector, and this is a growing sector. So where I came in was trying to see about these credentials. I just like this picture because it's a picture put out by Rewilding Europe showing the place of wild horses in the whole restoration. And isn't it good that he's an Exmoor? It's showing that their grazing can have many effects. It can have a knock-on effect that, you know, improves the diversity by their dung, the way they graze reducing biomass, the way they graze increasing other species, the way they graze having a knock-on effect by the way they impact on vegetation, impacting on pollinators and other insects, the way the birds are taking their fur. I think it's just a nice one picture. This is what our ponies do in the environment. Is there a big scope for this? Well, as you can see, the pale colours here across the whole of North America, a great deal of South America, and the whole of Eurasia. That is during the Pleistocene period, which we are looking at 12,500 to 2.5 million years ago, was the natural range of the forerunners of our modern horses. And that's where they grazed, and that's where they shaped the environment. It's their shaping of that environment as Pleistocene ecological engineers that created the temperate environment that we live in now. So that was their range. The bright green is where they are naturally found now, but the rest of it is the range of where they could be and where they might have to go at some point to help with the restoration. So we are, I think I told you all this a few years ago, in 2021, we are in the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration, which is going to go until 2030. And there are two very salient points to take on board with that. The first is there can be no successful species conservation without habitat preservation. So the whole future of the Exmoor pony, there's no point in us conserving them in isolation. Conserving the ponies in their habitat, as part of their habitat, as engineers in their habitat, and the way they positively influence their habitat is what will give them a safe and secure future role. And that's the Hill on Square. An integrated approach improves the future prospect for our target species, our ecosystems, and ultimately for us all. I mean, to take a tragic example, polar bears' habitat is disappearing at great speed. The future of the polar bear is not good. There are not likely to be wild polar bears in a few more years because their habitat will have gone because it's been destroyed. What I want to see is that we have a habitat for our Exmoor ponies, that they are seen to be supporting that habitat, and therefore they've got a future because they've got somewhere to live, and that interaction between them and their environment is the key way to sell this and to secure them. So, right at the beginning of my PhD, one of my supervisors, Jason Mathiopoulos, who's a wonderful chap, by the way, challenged me to make one slide that summed up the whole of my PhD. So what I wanted to look at was the interactions that the Exmoors have amongst themselves with their parasites, and we all know that they have those. What happens and how the climate and weather impacts on them and on their parasite loads and on the vegetation and soil that they graze on, the impact they have on their vegetation and soil, and how that is variable on different sites where the soil microbiome may be different, where all sorts of different environmental factors may be in action. That arrow is, we don't know what impact climate and weather really have on parasites. That's not tested out. The blue arrow shows negative. Well, we know that parasites tend to have a negative effect on body condition. And the other arrows are red, white, and blue, which means that the effects are unknown, positive or negative. And it means they could be a combination of any of them, depending on how extreme those effects are, how prolonged those effects are, and what the particular site-specific effects. So, you know, we could say that a good summer's great for them, but then it dried up grass, so they didn't have enough to eat. We could say that a really wet winter, had a negative effect on their condition. It's so variable because it's all about getting the balance right. So the factors could go in any direction. So thus the 3 coloured arrows were investigating under what situations is this positive, under which situations do we not know what it's doing, which is rather a lot of them, or under which situations it's a negative influence. So the first part of my PhD was called ecological interactions. And so PhD supervisors really like you to outline the gaps in knowledge. And the answer was there were very few scientific studies on this, particularly with Exmoors. So my first PhD question, I am getting to the point slowly, is what is the impact of Exmoor ponies grazing on plant communities and biodiversity? Because wildlife managers, farmers, anybody who might be interested in them as an eco-engineer is going to want to know, right, so what do they actually do? How much impact do they have? How quickly does that impact happen? So I was having an attempt to measure and quantify all this. Method of study. Well, originally we had this great idea that we were going to do this in numerous places, including Exmoor, all over the country, but then that irritating little thing called COVID came along. So that scuppered that. So basically I was only allowed to do a study at home, which was very useful. I was literally the only student who was allowed to do fieldwork during the COVID lockdowns because my argument was, well, I'm working from home. This is my home. It's my own farm. It's my own hill. So that's why the study was located only in the Highlands. It would have been at other sites around the country as well, but it couldn't happen, sadly. So that's where we live in Sgurrig. First Exmoors were taken there, for those of you who don't know, in 1970. I took the herd over in 1982. We've had Exmoors roaming around there ever since. So that's where I live. That's the other side of the hill. And an old friend of ours kindly allowed us to use his crop just across the loch as well. So we applied 4 grazing treatments, which means we did 4 different comparisons of the different effects of Exmoors. And this is a very unique study because, to the best of my knowledge currently, nobody has actually ever been able to apply these because they haven't had the Exmoors in the situation that we have. So although my study was limited to 1 site and not multiple sites, it managed to do what we call longitudinal, meaning long time study, which is a very rare thing. So because I'd had the Exmoors a long time, we studied areas grazed by the ponies for longer than 30 years, continuously grazed by them and not by other species, which means that after 30 years of ground continuously grazed by them and not by other species, except for the occasional rogue sheep that crept in, Vivian helped chase them out, or the occasional naughty deer, the principal impact was by the ponies. So we knew after 30 years that's likely to show us what their impact really is. Then the next one, and we did this area and did this study sometimes literally over one side of the fence to another, but always within an area where the ground was similar. We looked at areas grazed exclusively by cattle and sheep. So this was in the Highlands, so it was mostly Cheviot or blackface sheep and commercial cattle, part Red Angus, part Red Galloway, whatever we had, the ones that survive well. And a neighbour kindly allowed me to measure the impact that cattle were having. So this was a field continuously grazed by commercial animals for 30 years. So again, we would see what the long-term impact of their grazing would be. Again, a really good selling point because they will have had time to stabilise the vegetation under that regime. Then we had an exclusion area. This was a fun bit, trying to sort the fence out, because again, if COVID hadn't been in the way, I might have been able to make better use of the ground, but we had to use areas that were already fenced because we couldn't fence specifically. So we shot ponies out from an area that they previously grazed for 30 years. And we decided to see what happened when you take the Exmoors off. Does the vegetation get better? Does the species composition change? Does it get worse? What goes on? Take them off, see what happens when you remove them to a no grazing situation. And then finally, we had an area where we introduced the ponies, and it was into an area where nothing, except the occasional naughty deer that jumped over the fence, not many, had been grazing. So it was a really neglected, in a way, arguably, perhaps not. It was an area that had not been previously grazed by anything, and we wanted to see how does the vegetation change when you put Exmoors into an area like that. So nice comparisons. How we collected the data. Thank you, Vivian. There's a picture of her crawling around in the midges, counting plants for me. It's called random sampling. So what we did, we wandered out in the field. You use these quadrats. They're ½ metre square with little squares. And you wander across the field and you avoid 10 metres around the edge so you don't get edge effect. You wander around the field and you shut your eyes and you go ding right over your shoulder. And where it lands, random selection to make sure you're not fixing anything. You then have to crawl up, mark the spot, don't you, Vivian? And then sit there in the midges and count how many plants are present and note down what plants are present. And as none of us that were doing it were absolutely top-end botanists, we don't pretend we identified every single plant down to the minutest detail. But what we were able to do was to categorize them according to their functional traits. So we could look at whether they were flowering plants, whether they were grasses, whether they were sedges, whether they were mosses, whether they were rushes. We did categorize that. Those are the effective traits that matter in ecological terms, the proportions of those, the diversity within those, the abundance of those, and how they're interacting. So we did a lot of that. We did that on the same plots, identical plots every year. And the plots were in close proximity. So the way we made sure, it wasn't because it was on completely different soil or in a completely different climate zone or something like that that might have influenced the distribution. They were in the same weather area because they were all within a couple of miles of each other, sometimes literally one side of a fence to another when we could, but all within a very close area. They had the same climate, they had the same exposure. We're talking northwest Scotland here, plenty of exposure. Same altitude. We didn't do ones on the top of the mountain and ones at the bottom of Deep Valley. They were all more or less the same level above sea level. All on slopes and on very similar slopes. We didn't do one halfway up a cliff and one on flatbed. They had the same drainage, pretty much the same underlying rock, which happened to be Torridonian sandstone, and the same soil type. And all of that, in scientific terms, was to minimize the other variables. So what it meant was, what we were testing was the variable we were interested in, the impact of grazing. We weren't looking at the variable of, the soil type or the weather or anything. We were looking at the impact of grazing. And it was our way of isolating to test for that one variable. What effect did it have? And here are the results. Aren't they pretty? Shannon, that is a very recognized measure of biodiversity. Sedges, grasses, rushes, flowering plants, and mosses. I don't expect you to read these graphs. I'm going to give you a quick summary of what the results told us. You're welcome to ask questions afterwards. We discovered that long-term impact of the pony grazing, i.e. on the land where the ponies had been grazing for a long time, there was a significant, and we tested this statistically, because if you're going to publish, which we're going to, or if you're going to make a big impression on organisations, it has to be scientifically verified. We found that there was a statistically significant increase in biodiversity on the plots where the ponies grazed compared to the other plots. And particularly, what we found really interesting was that flowering plant abundance was particularly affected by their grazing, more than the grasses, more than the sedges, the mosses, the other plants. It was flowering plants. We had more flowering plants, both more flowering plants and a greater range of flowering plants on the areas where the ponies had been grazing. Very significant. So this is the quick one, so you don't have to read a graph, because frankly, I prefer this too. That's year one, and this is just to represent, limited species, but they're looking good. That was when we introduced them into an area. By year 4, when they've been on there, we have more species, and we have more of some of the species. So putting ponies onto the ungrazed area, we saw it change from relatively few species to more species, so greater biodiversity, and more species in terms of abundance of the flowers in particular, which of course has a knock-on effect for pollinators. And I'm sure you all know that pollinators are very important. We should all be worrying about our bees and our other pollinating creatures, because without them, our crops are going to be a problem. So exmoor grazing onto a new area where they were introduced increases both floral diversity and abundance. Nice fancy words to take home. Really positive. And the other thing that made me very happy Other studies from Denmark and the Czech Republic and the Netherlands, nobody did it on 30-year plots, nobody did it quite the way I did, but they were seeing similar results. We were all paralleling. So there's more scientists in other places looking and going, oh yeah, you know, we're starting to see the same pattern. This is always a good thing. It means you probably haven't made a horrible mistake and you're probably doing the right thing. So great take-home message. I will be writing a paper that we'll publish on this. This is very exciting. A great start. Right, please don't be terrified. When you say the word Bayesian to me, I'm absolutely terrified. Bayesian is a particular type of statistical modelling. My supervisor, Jason Mathiopoulos, is a well-known Bayesian statistician. What it showed was what we wanted to show, but we didn't know it would until we tested it. Overall increased biodiversity, especially of flowering plants, is associated with exmoor grazing. So this was yet another statistical test, including some predictive. So very quick run through. This side is the travel time for all plants. Travel time meaning how long did the change take to happen? So the low plateau here, year 1 is where we introduced the ponies. This is using our real data. And up it went until it plateaued, which means that the change from an area where they hadn't been grazing and we'd introduced them to an area which had the equivalent biodiversity of where they'd been, reaching the high plateau, was 5 years. We saw change in 5 years. Now, when I started, our head of institute in Glasgow said, are you going to see enough change in the duration of a PhD to actually make this a valid study and measure? And I said, I don't know. And we did. So this is really cool. So this is the level where the ponies are absent. This is the level where the ponies are present for a long period. And this is showing how it changes when you add the ponies in and what it reaches. On this side is the time travel for flowering plants. And it's exactly the same. Year 1, where you introduce them, tick, 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 up to the end of my current study, where we finished it. This is what happens when you remove them. The study predicts that there would not be a significant drop-off for 4 or 5 years. This is where the level of flowering plants would be when you introduce them and where you take them away. When we ran the model on just test data, it predicted that their effect would wear off relatively quickly. What we actually saw, and this is a prediction, and it does need to be tested on more data, is that it actually might remain quite stable. So this tells us that they can quite quickly do something very positive, both in terms of overall plant diversity and in flowering plants when you introduce them. So again, this is good news. I am going to state very firmly, this is very provisional. Only 4 years of results, only 4 years of results on one site is a good indicator. It makes us feel really good, but it doesn't guarantee it would happen everywhere all the time. But it is an exciting indicator, and we were really, really pleased with this. So before I came down, Jason said, oh, you're going to go and talk to your funders. And I said, yes. And he said, don't show them all my predictions yet. We've got more work to do on this. Just explain to them, this is looking good, but it's a work in progress. So it's work in progress, but it is reinforcing what we found, and we are very excited about it. So I rather like this one. This one wasn't actually from mine. This is from a place called Mols in Denmark. And what you can see on A, this is the side where it's a turf dug from by the fence in an area where Exmoors and Galloway cattle were grazing. And what you can see is the vegetation is quite short because they've been eating it. And each of those labels represents a plant species that is found within that turf. They cut 2 identical sized turfs, one on the side of the fence, B, where nothing had been grazing, an exclusion area like the exclusion area I had, and one on the side of the fence where it was Exmoors and Galloway cattle grazing. And as you can see, I didn't actually count those labels, but as you can see, lots of species, low biomass because they've been eating it, but lots of species. The ungrazed side, just fenced off and left. 1, 2, 3. Pretty good, quick visual explanation, isn't it? That grazing increases the biodiversity on sites. That's very positive. Okay. Yeah, it's a cake. There's a big tradition at Glasgow University that when you finish your PhD, you're given a cake that represents your PhD. And I spoke to Anna Babb and the other students, and I said, I have a complete phobia about animal cakes. Please don't make me a cake that looks like an Exmoor pony. I won't like it. It's just a personal thing. So my lovely supervisor, Jason, designed a cake that represented our plans for the Bayesian. So we have an Exmoor pony made of marshmallows, grazing on a lovely, diverse, biodiverse, with flowers and everything side, and then the fence, and the sheep grazing, representing the commercial animals on the slightly bald side. And his son very kindly, he designed the cake and his son very kindly executed it. And I was actually so overwrought when it came to the celebration after my exam, I actually didn't eat it. But I'm told by Vivian and other people there it's absolutely delicious. So yeah, traditional cake as my well done present. And all I could say was, thank you, it looks wonderful. And I didn't manage to do anything else. But I think that's a real work of art, frankly. So go and do a PhD and then make a cake. So our conclusions, be slightly more serious. Grazing by Exmoor ponies has a positive effect on overall biodiversity and particularly on flowering plant abundance. Commercial cattle and sheep grazing in this study showed lower overall biodiversity and flowering plant abundance. Positive results manifest in 4 to 5 years, and it's in red because that's what I was told wouldn't happen. And I got very excited about it. I do get a bit excited and I run around screaming when I get a good result. It's just how I am. And further investigation with more standardized sampling could improve our results. Now, every scientist says that. And it is a real shame that COVID got in the way and we couldn't do other sites to reinforce the results. But we are confident that on our sites this worked, and we are pretty confident. It might not be exactly the same rate and exactly the same species, but we're pretty confident the trend would continue. So something we are going to continue, aren't we, Vivian, in monitoring, because we're not going to stop this now. We want a 10-year data set and a 20-year data set to keep testing whether it really does persist. But we're also going to instigate doing it in other places as well if we possibly can, just to reinforce these results, because to be honest, they were a lot better than I thought they were going to be. This is a little very exciting hint, which we didn't get a chance for all sorts of reasons to investigate further. These are readings from a thing called Tomtslogger, which I learnt about while I was doing a master's degree in Norway, which wasn't actually to do with Exmoor ponies, but it was to do with grazing. They're little loggers that you stick in the ground and they tell you what the soil moisture is 10 centimetres below the ground. They tell you what the soil temperature is 10 centimetres below at ground level and at 10 centimetres above. And we got some of these and we thought it would be rather fun to see if we saw a difference, given that we had the long-term grazed area by ponies, the long-term grazed area by cattle and sheep, the exclusion area where we'd removed them, and the area where we'd just introduced them. And what you can see on here, the wiggly brown line is the soil moisture percentage, and the green lines are the soil temperature. And these were loggers that were in fields that were pretty much next to each other. So, you know, the temperature looks pretty much identical, which it should. But that is the ungrazed area, the control area. And look how, exactly the same time period, the soil moisture 10 centimetres below is fluctuating. This one is where the ponies have been grazing for a long time. 10 centimetres below ground. Look at the difference. That soil moisture, I mean, it fluctuates, of course it does, but it's a lot more stable. This is something I think we should be investigating further, because soil moisture stabilisation is very important for us all, particularly with climate changing, but it also influences, she looks around at Richard slightly nervously, carbon storage. It's a big factor in that too. So it's a hint to us that our ponies are doing something that could influence that. But we didn't have a chance to follow that up further. And this is something I fully intend to follow up more. What is happening here? There is definitely something going on, but we need longer term study on this. I'm going to see what we're doing. I've got some more Tomtslogers. They will be getting put out. We're going to be looking at that. And here's a cool one, final one. So I'll stop talking in a minute because you're probably all getting bleeding ears and frankly I need a drink. 2, science is about collaboration. Science is always about collaboration. Nobody can do it in isolation. It's a ridiculous concept to think we could. We all need to collaborate. And one of the things I really want to do is put Exmoors on the map across the scientific picture. Not just what I've done, but what everybody sees. So there is Jason. There's some of the ideas behind and indications from our Bayesian model. And he presented that at a very big mathematical conference recently. So Jason went out and he can't spell Exmoor. And I did also point out he couldn't spell my name right after I've known him for 9 years. But he's now out working on that model. That model is going to be really influential across the board for people who are interested in ecology. The concept behind that model is a very big deal. So it's an ongoing process, but he's already out there presenting this. I put my hands in the air, I couldn't have written the code, but you know. The other one, where Exmoor's helped science, please don't laugh. This is automated repeated aerial observations of GPS-collared animals using UVAs and open source electronics. Right, we have a lot of students in Glasgow who work in the Serengeti and the Masai Mara, and obviously tracking the wildlife there is very important. So I had some really, really lovely students say, we need to test the collars we're going to be putting on wildebeests and other animals to measure their migration. Please, could you help us? So I went, well, I do have some ponies I could catch and put a head collar on, and we could probably try using those for natural animal movement. So that is russet, by the way, Diane Ruth. We went out and amenable ponies, we put these little trackers, only that big, on the head collars for a few hours, and they put their drones up and they measured them. And they used it as a way of calibrating their drones and making all their equipment work and testing that it actually was nicely accurate on where the ponies were and what they were doing. And then once it had all been proven on the ponies, and I spent quite some days chivvying ponies up and down hills and pleading with them to move and trying to get them to do things so that we actually got nice readings. But in the end, it worked. And it worked really well. And that equipment tested on Exmoor ponies is now being used for real in the Serengeti to do animal monitoring. And there's a paper that's been published about it, acknowledging that the Exmoors contributed to the study. So this is a very small but quite significant way that they've contributed to a bigger picture wildlife management study. So I got very excited about that.